Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a really deep theological work that gets right to the heart of one of history's biggest questions. Who exactly was Jesus Christ, according to the Christian scriptures? You know, for 2,000 years, the person of Jesus has been this source of endless fascination and debate. This quote kind of captures that feeling of both awe and intense scrutiny. And the author we're looking at today says, hey, this isn't just some dusty old historical puzzle. It's a question that really demands an answer. So to set the stage, the author uses this really powerful image from another theologian. Was Jesus a storm wave? You know, a massive historical force for sure, but one that was ultimately a product of his time and eventually just fades back into history? Or was he the rock? Something totally different, a force that stands against the flood of history and actually changes its course forever. And this is where we get to the core of the author's whole argument. He says that if you look at the Christian scriptures, they don't really give you a comfortable middle ground. The evidence, he claims, logically pushes you towards one of two very different conclusions. Either Jesus was divine or he was human. That's it. All right, so to test this big idea, where do you start? Well, the author takes us all the way back to the beginning, to the absolute earliest evidence we have, the writings of the very first generation of Christians. What did the people who were there in the decades right after Jesus' life actually believe about him? Now, you've probably heard this idea, right? That maybe Jesus was a great teacher, and then over hundreds of years, his followers kind of mythologized him, turning him into a god, sort of like what happened with figures like Buddha. The author directly challenges that, saying the timeline we see in the Christian sources tells a completely different story. Think about this for a second. We're talking only 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death, and the letters of the Apostle Paul are already making the rounds. And in those letters, the author argues you find a fully baked belief in a divine Christ who existed before his own birth. And it doesn't stop there. Texts like Revelation and the Gospel of John pop up soon after, all within that first century, and all presenting what's called a high Christology, this core belief in Christ's divinity. And what's really incredible, according to the text, is how consistent this view is. It wasn't just one guy in one little community. We're seeing it across the board, from Paul to John to the book of Hebrews. They all seem to share this unified picture. Christ existed before, he is divine, he will judge the world, and he is to be worshipped. And this is a super important point the author makes. Writers like Paul aren't trying to convince people of some wild new idea. They don't argue for Christ's divinity. They just talk about it like it's something everybody already knows and agrees on. It's the starting point for their conversations, not the thing they're debating. Okay, so if that's what the early church believed, does it actually line up with the original stories of Jesus' life? For that, the author says we have to go back even further, to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, the author points to a series of what he calls stupendous claims that Jesus makes about himself. First up, the authority to forgive sins. You have to remember, in that time and place, forgiving sins was something only God could do. So for a man to claim that authority, that was a massive, radical statement. And then there's the claim, which pops up all over the Gospels, that he, Jesus, will be the one to judge the entire world at the end of time. Again, the author notes, this is a rule that was exclusively reserved for God in the Scriptures. And finally, there's this one. A claim that points to a kind of omnipresence, an ability to be with his followers everywhere, at any time. The author argues that when you put these claims together, they're not the words of just a prophet. They suggest a person who sees himself as having a much higher, divine identity. So what you get, the author argues, is this really fascinating dual portrait. On one hand, you see a truly human life. He gets sad, he suffers, he's tempted. But at the same time, he moves through the world as this supernatural figure who is sinless, performs miracles not as straining acts but as its natural works, and claims to have all authority in heaven and on earth. The two sides are woven together. Okay, so if the Gospels and the early church present this picture, what about some of the more modern ideas that try to find a middle ground? The author turns next to theories that say, sure, Christ was divine in some way, but maybe not fully God. One of the big concepts in these theories is the idea of a God-filled man. Now, this is different. This isn't God becoming a man. It's the idea of a perfect human being who, through his own perfect life, becomes so in sync with God's will that he becomes a perfect reflection of God. And this slide really gets to the heart of the author's critique. He's saying there is a massive difference between these two ideas. A human who ascends to a perfect relationship with God is one thing. A divine being who descends to become a human is something else entirely. They are not, he argues, the same concept. So, in the end, the author concludes these middle ground theories just don't hold up. And why is that? Well, a few big reasons. They can't really explain claims that Jesus existed before he was born. They don't have a good answer for his role as judge of the world. And to make their theories work, they basically have to treat these huge claims as just metaphors, which, the author says, doesn't really do justice to the texts. So we've looked at the early church, we've looked at the Gospels, we've looked at the critiques of other theories, and that brings us right to the author's final conclusion. The author basically asks us to take a step back and just look at the trail of evidence we've been following. Given this incredibly high view of Christ, so early and so consistently, what's the most logical explanation for it all? And the argument is laid out as this really clear three-step path. 1, the earliest documents we have treat Christ's divinity as a fact. 2, the stories of his life in the Gospels actually back this up with his own words and actions. And 3, other attempts to explain it all in a less supernatural way just don't fit all the data. And so we arrive at the author's central assertion. The doctrine of the Incarnation, the idea of a divine person becoming human, isn't some later philosophical add-on. He argues it's the only theory that makes internal sense of everything the scriptures present, from beginning to end. It's the key, he says, that unlocks the whole puzzle. And in the end, the author doesn't just leave us with a neat and tidy answer. He brings us right back to the question itself. The whole point isn't to end the debate, but to show why, according to these texts, this one question has echoed with such force through 2,000 years of history, challenging every single generation to find its own answer.